Good morning, students. I hope you are still well and safe. As we begin the last chapter in our textbook, we're going to be talking about some matters that are very much on the minds of everyone in the world right now. The main discussion in this last chapter is a global economy. It came into focus, especially after the spectacular collapse of Soviet communism in 1990. And what has happened since that time is a new economic order that has developed that has been characterized by an expansion of trade between countries. And of course, technological developments have had a tremendous part in this new global economy that has developed in our world today. Because with a lot of these technological advances, borders have basically been broken down and distances have, of course, been narrowed. So, international trade. Now, this is not something new. Remember, we have talked in the course about the fact that even in the Bronze Age, there was trade, long distance trade going on. As Western Europe emerges out of the Middle Ages, it's trade that is going to spur the age of discovery and so on. Afro-Eurasia has been linked by trade via the Silk Roads and so on for years and years and years. But now, with airplane travel, with computers, and so on, we have more and more trade going on in the world. In fact, it is such a big thing that at Baylor School in Chattanooga, Mandarin Chinese is being taught because you have some high school students who are wanting to major in international business, and they realize China is one of those major partners in the world that is going to have to be dealt with. Now, there are drawbacks, obviously, to this. One of them we're living in right now, a pandemic that arose in one country and has simply just spread around the world. But another disadvantage we found in 2008, that when one of these major trade countries begins to have an economic recession, like dominoes, it affects all the other countries with which that country has trade. We saw this in the Great Depression, but 2008 reminded us of it once again. So what has been taking place, and shall we say to a great extent in the 21st century? Well, we have a lot of global corporations now, and they have replaced the traditional national or multinational forms of corporate enterprises. Global corporations rely on a small headquarters staff, and they spread operation functions then across the globe looking for the lowest possible operating cost. A lot of American businesses, for example, have gone to other countries because it's cheaper to produce the products there than it is to produce them in the United States. Not every nation in the world has the pay scale that is found here in the United States. So these corporations are technically no longer bound to any particular location in the world. They have moved jobs from high-wage facilities to locations where wages are low, and quite honestly, many times, environmental laws are weak or non-existent. And when we talk about low wages, sometimes these are sweatshops. These are places where women and children can be abused. And so, yes, as generally comes with major changes, you can have abuses taking place in the backgrounds as well. Well, let's talk about some of these folks. Japan. Of course, let's realize Japan was pretty much destroyed following World War II. But by 1949, Japan had already attained its pre-war level of productivity. And Japanese government channeled a whole lot of the nation's savings into its own economic development. So to say the least, when Japan came back, Japan came roaring back and has become a major competitor in the world, especially in electronics and the automobile industry. So Japan emphasized an export-oriented growth supported by low wages, and this has helped them turn the tide and become a major competitor. Now, sadly for Japan, in 2011, there was a 9.0 earthquake and a tsunami that followed that killed over 28,000 people and actually damaged a nuclear reactor. And it took Japan a while to be able to recover from that. All right, let's talk about what your textbook calls the little tigers: Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They have taken their apparent disadvantages into, once again, having an export-driven industrialization. Latin America could learn a lot from some of these Asian countries. Now, South Korea has done something very unique. In 2013, they elected the first woman leader of an Asian nation, which was quite the stir at the time. China has launched some economic reforms. Now, when we say this, let's keep in mind China is still a communist nation, but they have opened their markets to the world, and as a result have become one of the major competitors in the world economic market. They have a cheap pool of labor, and they are someone to be reckoned with in this global economy. They hosted the Olympic Games in 2008, and this actually helped China some. They lightened up a little bit in some respects, especially in the area of religion. Christianity was given a little more leeway in China, although China tends to have its own state Christian church, and it would very much prefer that all people that want to be Christians in China be a part of that state church. But China tends to pirate innovations from other countries and then come up with their own form of these, and they are not above computer sabotage and whatever. So though China has become a major competitor, China also needs to be someone that is majorly watched. During this current C-19 virus, they were not forthcoming when the virus first hit. They were not honest. They were not truthful. They did not shut down international travel. And of course, they contributed in a very great way to the current global pandemic that is going on. And so, as we see, there have been some emerging economies here, and we would have to throw Russia into this. And these major economies have all become huge competitors with the United States. Now, some other emerging economies: Brazil, India, Mexico. I've already mentioned Russia. Several of the former communist East European states, and several of the countries in Africa have really come out. Mexico still, and to an extent Central America, remain plagued by drug cartels, and these drug cartels are very powerful and very influential. Russia is plagued by a mafia that assumes a lot of control. They have a lot of power, a lot of money, and of course Russia also has Putin, who has figured out all kinds of ways to be able to keep himself in power. And quite honestly, Putin is popular in Russia. Russians are used to very autocratic government. They had it under the czars, they had it under the communists, and Putin fits their standard of that type of government. And so in Russia, he is quite popular. And of course, he wants to once again make Russia a major player internationally in the world. And Russia has begun to become very much involved in the Middle East, as well as other places. And they are becoming a major player, shall I say, in the world oil market. Okay, now the United States has had an advantage through the years because we have now 50 states that are basically borderless, that are involved in a general national economy. Europe began to recognize this, and so in 1957, the nations of France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg began to establish a European economic community. By 1993, that community was known as the European Union. 27 nations have submerged much of their national sovereignty into the European Union, And in 1999, 13 of the members adopted a common currency called the euro. They broke down borders. You could travel from France to Germany to Belgium to wherever and not have to go through passport controls and so on. And once communism fell, many of the eastern states also joined. But interestingly enough, the EU has suffered during this current pandemic that we are under. They have locked their borders. They have gone back to a form of nationalism. Britain pulled out of the EU this year, and Britain was a major player in it. If a few more nations decide to pull out in the next few years, it could well be that the European Union will wind up failing as an idea. But Greece, Italy, Ireland, these countries have struggled with their economies, as have some of the Eastern European states that have come in. Now, another very successful group is called OPEC. These are your oil-producing states, especially in the Middle East, although Venezuela and a few countries in the West are involved in this. And of course, what they try to do is control the price of oil. And of course, our world runs on oil. And in the 70s, they were able to cause major shortages in the United States and in Western Europe. And so wars have affected the flow of oil. Of course, we talked about the first Gulf War. We will talk about the second one here in this chapter. Now, during 2011, there was what has been called the Arab Spring, where individuals in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco tried to bring down their governments for more moderate Muslim states, but more democratic Muslim states. And a lot of this was done by young people who were communicating with each other through computers and emails and other things. Now, as a result of this, Syria plunged itself into a civil war that has been horrific. That civil war has brought about untold civilian casualties, as the current government has little to no concern about the average person in that nation. And right now there is a humanitarian crisis going on in the nation of Syria as a result of all of this. And it'll be interesting to see where all of this goes. Now, basically, the Arab Spring, like some of our early revolutions in Western Europe, failed. Egypt is probably the one country that brought about the most change. And you have a leader in Egypt now who is calling for a very moderate form of Islam, not only in Egypt, but throughout. Okay, some of these Asian nations have gotten together and tried to put together a co-op. And even the United States has been involved. In 93, we signed what was called NAFTA, which made Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. a free trade zone that has recently been modified somewhat and renegotiated. But there is a lot of cooperation in many ways between the three nations, Canada and Mexico, both producing a lot of automobile parts. So, you have proponents bragging that globalization brings about a new prosperity. But as I said, the recession of 2008 showed just how much this tying together of nations can actually hurt nations when one of the major players has economic problems. But then you have its critics. They criticize that it diminishes sovereignty of local and national governments and transfers power to international corporations and global institutions. And there are many in the United States, and let's remember the United States has always had its isolationist tendencies. There are many that are made very uncomfortable like this. But as we are witnesses of right now today, this world with limited borders, so to speak, it is easy for a pandemic to be able to spread worldwide. This is not the first time. Just a little over 100 years ago, right after World War I, we had the Spanish flu that killed millions worldwide. We studied in the Middle Ages about the Black Death, the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague followed the trade routes. It was expanded by the global trade that was going on at that time. And so this is always going to be a consideration. This is always going to be an issue of this idea of globalization. And you've got a lot of people addressing this right now, trying to figure out what is going to happen in the future. It may well be that a lot of countries, after looking at this current pandemic, are going to kind of reel things back in. There are many in the United States, in our government even, calling for that right now. Let's bring our corporations back in. Let's get out of some of this internationalism that is going on. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Does the European Union reopen its borders, or is there going to be some limitations on that? And if there is, what will that do to the total process? The U.S. currently is closing itself to immigration temporarily. Look at air travel right now. The air industry will probably look very different worldwide after this pandemic is over. Many American countries are saying they're going to cut back the number of flights and whatnot, and I'm sure many of the major carriers throughout the world are saying the same thing. And when you talk about the air industry shutting down, as it has, that is shutting down the oil industry, and it's also interrelated that when one domino falls, multiple dominoes begin to fall. And so the economic repercussions of what we are living through right now are going to be very interesting. And the changes that are made are also going to be very interesting indeed. And of course, people are predicting all over the place. You and I hopefully will be able to see what results from this afterwards. Well, not only does your textbook talk about globalization, but it also talks about Americanization. America has developed a consumer culture that has been exported to the entire world. You have food, beverage products, clothing. Quite honestly, McDonald's almost owns the world. In fact, the one nation that McDonald's does not really dominate in, believe it or not, is China. It's Kentucky Fried Chicken there. But American foods, restaurants, when I was traveling to Cuba via Cancun, Mexico, there was even a Bubba Gump shrimp company in the Cancun airport, along with McDonald's and all kinds of other American fast foods. And so the world knows about the United States. They know about what we have and what we don't have and so on. And quite honestly, English is becoming the primary language of global communications. We now have communication by radio, cell phone, television, computers. And so the social, economic, and political isolation of the past, except in a few definite holdouts, some of your communist states and some of your states that are held by military powers where they check all of these things, communication is there. People know. And I would say that historically, as new histories are being written, that Steve Jobs will probably go down near Edison as one of the greatest inventors and geniuses that the United States ever produced. What he has come up with is totally amazing. The Mac computer, 1984, the iPod in 2001, the iPhone in 2007, the iPad in 2010, and I understand Apple still has designs and ideas of his that they have not yet produced. And so, this is going to be interesting to see how global communication takes place. You're a beneficiary of it. You are able to attend this lecture because of technology. I am able to make this lecture because of technology. We may not physically be together, but yet we can be together. Now, a side note here. As we have had this pandemic, we've had the opportunity to see American genius at work again. For example, breweries quit producing alcohol and started producing hand sanitizer. College universities started designing special clothing, as did many different little small companies, to help protect the frontline people in the hospitals who were dealing with this pandemic. And so, bad as it has been, difficult as it has been, American genius once again has come out. And it is alive and well. And I will also add to that, the American sense of humor is still also alive and well. There are all kinds of funny little things being passed around via the internet, via YouTube, and so on, that will make us chuckle and laugh in the midst of all of this. But to think about Jobs and what he has done, in 2012, Apple became the most valuable company in world history. And the potential's still there for more. Television, well, that has been used to promote state building. For example, North Korea controls everything that is said in the news. So people in North Korea, pretty much Cuba, I'm sure China is the same way, Vietnam, these are people, they are told only what they want to, the government wants them to know. And they know little more. These countries have ways of blocking international access. They have setups where instead of being able to have internet in your home or whatever, you have to go to public sites. And at these public sites, of course, they're able to keep tabs on you and watch you. And so we still live in a world with a lot of troubles, and let's kind of go into some of those and discuss those. Number one, we have had a 5-fold population increase in the last 300 years. And of course, that has had a tremendous environmental problem. You have the expanding of humans into new areas, which tampers with zones where animals used to live and their habitats are being destroyed. I mean, it's interesting when you have cougars running around LA suburbs. You have bears going into suburbs and cities and raiding garbage cans. Deers breaking into businesses because they're not used to the big glass fronts and so on. And so all of these things are having an effect. People in Brazil are destroying the rainforest in unprecedented ways, and all that is pure greed taking place. Yes, we have glacier melting. By the way, that's been going on for a long time. My wife and I were able to go to Alaska last May, and we went actually physically walking to a glacier, and there were signs along our trek that showed us where the glacier was in 17 and something, and where it was in 18 and something, and where it was at the turn of the 20th century. And so glaciers melting have been going on for a long time. It is not a product of the late 20th century alone. We do have to deal with heat. It is said that 2012 was the hottest year on average recorded in history, and that 2012 had an abundance of national disasters. But then 2013 turned around and was cooler than normal. And so there always will be cycles going on in our world. There was a mini ice age during the Middle Ages that helped set up for the pandemic of the Black Death. And so changes in environment and so on are something we must be concerned about, we must try to deal with, but obviously it has been a part of Earth history and will continue to be a part. But then, your textbook makes a point that there are several 100 million people, especially in developing areas of Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, that struggle for clean food, clean water, adequate shelters, and other necessities. I want you to think. Imagine you're a parent in Africa. You're having to leave the village where you lived because there's nothing. You don't have adequate food supplies for you and your 2 children. And here you are with a bunch of refugees making a move. And along the way, you have to decide which child you're going to leave behind. Now, most of you say, oh, no, I would never do that. That's not a decision I would ever make. But yet, there are families in our world today that are forced to make decisions like that. So, we have a world of global haves and have-nots. And with that in mind, I want to give you a hierarchy of nations. And this is based on economics, providing for the people, and so on. Obviously, number one, the U.S. is almost alone at the top of this list. We are one of the most prosperous countries anywhere. Most teenagers in even prosperous European states don't have automobiles like you guys do. In fact, most families in Europe have 1 car, and they're satisfied with that. They live in much smaller quarters. We enjoy a lot of benefits living in the United States. And with its problems, and all nations have problems, the U.S. is still the greatest nation on earth. I've been able to do some limited travel in the world, and I have never seen anywhere that rivaled the U.S. Number 2 would be those nations that are fully industrialized democracies. A lot of these are Western European states. And they are competing, they are doing well. They would be that second tier of nations. Number 3, we have about 88 middle-income nations. These are in the Middle East, parts of Asia, and some in Latin America. And these nations ebb and wane. They do good sometimes. They don't do so well other times. And so they are back and forth. Then we have 66 low-income nations. Most of these are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And of course, let's realize in many respects, what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa is not totally always their fault. They have definitely been exploited on more than one occasion, and all of that exploitation of the slave trade and then colonialization in the late 19th century is still causing many of those states to struggle. As well, many of them, they're not even sure who's running the government. You've got cartels, you've got crime groups, you've got militias, and so there is all kinds of horrific things taking place in many of these states. And, of course, millions suffer as a result of that. And then number 5, we still have our communist holdouts, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and I would throw Venezuela in there. Venezuela has had quite a few demonstrations lately. They are trying to throw off the yoke of communism, and it is yet to be seen what will happen there. Now, supposedly, slavery has been banned in our world. Legally, it no longer exists. But in so many places, Southeast Asia being one of the big areas, you have people who are forced and bonded into labor practices that are terrible. Some folks call them sweatshops. You can call them whatever you want to. But people are basically locked into a very low-paying job that they have no hope for advancement or anything else. And much in South and Southeast Asia, you have child labor servitude. You actually have countries, and this to me is totally unimaginable, that parents will sell their children into servitude, or at least one of their children into servitude, to help keep things going. As a father, I cannot conceive of that, but yet it happens in our world. And then we have another problem. It's called human trafficking. It is said that up to 2 million human beings a year are bought and sold across international borders, and a lot of this is for the sex trade. Now you say, oh, that's a big city problem. That's a long way. In 2012, government agencies rescued some 75 children from the sex trade, and in doing so, there was a connection between Chattanooga and the international airport at Atlanta. Not that far away. You have child pornography, and these things are horrifically on the rise in our world today. Now, another horrific thought. There are nations, including India, which would be, one of those middle-income nations, where fathers will sell a child into this human trafficking. And again, as a dad, I cannot conceive of that. I cannot understand how a father could do such a thing as that. What kind of desperation would lead to such a despicable thing as that? Now, most of the victims are young women and women, which usually comes about because of their lower social and economic status in many countries. So these are problems we still have in our world today. And then your textbook talks about global diseases. Well, guess what, folks? We're living in one of those right now. As I say, This is not the first one. It definitely will not be the last one. But it is very much a fact and a part in our world today. With these letting up of international borders, with air travel being fairly frequent until recently, it would be very easy for pandemics to make their move, and they have done so. All right, as we go into the next section, let me tell you a little story. When my children were in college, they went on mission trips. Most of them flew out of Nashville, and my wife and I would go up there. We would help them check in. We would walk to the gate with them. We would sit there with them, watch them board the plane, watch the plane back out, and then we would leave the airport. When, as I mentioned, I went to Russia, all I had to have was a passport and a visa. There was no metal detectors, no examinations, no big questionnaires, none of this stuff. No long lines of waiting or whatever. And then 9/11/2001 took place. The United States, in the United States, was attacked in an unprecedented way. Terrorists and global terrorism is definitely a part of our society now, and I will have to say that the vast majority of global terrorism is by Muslim extremists. 9/11 were Muslim extremists. 4 American airliners were hijacked. 3 actually reached their targets. Both the main towers of the World Trade Center were destroyed. And that day, about 3,000 American lives were sacrificed. We found out just how porous these loose borders were. Every one of the terrorists was here on an education visa. And they gave us an education. They showed us just how vulnerable we really were. As the events transpired that day, one of the most amazing things was as they showed a picture of the grid that shows all air flights, except military, in the United States. That morning, oh man, it was busy. By that evening, because we didn't know if there were more terrorists or not, by that evening, there were no flights taking place across the United States. There were military planes up, but there were no civilian planes flying. There were planes landing in places they didn't intend to land, and Americans, Canadians, people all over the place were going to airports, taking total strangers into their homes because people had nowhere to go, because we didn't know what was going on. America fell to its knees. Prayers at the National Capitol building and so many other places, including the county square here in Marion County. Churches were opening their doors and having prayer meetings and prayer services. 9/11 rocked this nation, And of course, it changed it in ways that we will never, ever be able to go back. You will always be a child of 9/11. And you will never see the world that some of us saw before then. It was an amazing thing. And yet, as the U.S. tends to do, when horrific things happen, we tend to see the best come out in a whole lot of people. We suddenly had a whole new group of heroes, firefighters, police officers, in the case of New York, Harbor Patrol people. And while civilians were running away from these events, these people, many of them, were running toward those events. And many firefighters, police officers, ambulance personnel, these are going to be many of the people who lost their lives trying to save the lives of as many people as they possibly could. Excuse me. Now, I don't think the terrorists or anyone else expected the two main towers of the World Trade Center to totally collapse. I don't think they hoped for that. They just hoped to inflict as much damage as they possibly could. But of course, they did. America has now rebuilt. There is a new single tower there, and it is standing in pure defiance, saying, we are still here. About a year after that, my wife, my youngest daughter, and I went to New York. And part of our tour, we got to go to the World Trade Center site. And one of the impressive things to me about it was they left the sign for the underground rail system up. They didn't take it down. It was pitted, it was bent, it was damaged. But to me, it was New York saying, in no uncertain terms, we are still here. We will rise from this catastrophe. Now, I don't know. I haven't been back. I hope that particular sign, excuse me, is still there. I hope that defiance is still showing. Interesting thing happened. 1961, as John Kennedy is talking about the Berlin Wall, he made the statement, "Ich bin ein Berliner." And what he was saying was, we are all Berliners. Well, when 9/11 took place, the mayor of Berlin made the statement, "Ich bin ein New Yorker." They were all New Yorkers. Now, it was found out that the perpetrators of this were a part of an organization led by an individual named Osama bin Laden. Supposedly, he was angered over the Palestinian situation. We've already talked about that. We've discussed the sheer hypocrisy of Arabs being upset over that. But it is said that he was the one who masterminded these attacks. Now, where most of the world was shocked, many of the Arab nations celebrated. And then in 2011, when a U.S. SEAL team took Osama bin Laden out, they had been hunting for him, They found him. They took him out. There was actually dancing in the streets of America. But let's talk about this global terrorism. There have been train and bus bombings in England. There have been terrorist attacks on restaurants in France. A theater was actually taken over by terrorists in Russia, and a lot of civilians died there. And as I said earlier, the majority of these terrorist attacks are performed by radical Islamic extremists. The world is full of those. There have been minor attacks in the United States, but the majority are. Now, there is a big debate. Is Islam a violent religion? Well, if it is not, there are a lot of people who make it so. Now, Christianity had the Crusades. And so, people who embrace Christianity cannot say our hands are totally clean as far as the past goes. But I will say this, I teach this in my religions course. Violence and terrorism and murder and warfare as a part of religion is the dark side of religion. No matter what the religion is, that's the dark side of it. Yes, people can take the most benign religions on earth, if they so choose, and turn them into a horrifically terrible thing. And so, any kind of extremism, any kind, is a danger. It may be a danger locally, it may be a danger nationally, as we have seen. It may be a danger internationally. And so terrorism is something that we're going to have to live with. It is a part of our modern world. And until people learn to play nice, respect each other, and get along, terrorism is definitely going to continue to be something that we have to be aware of. We have to be attentive to. We have to be alert. Okay, this is a good stopping point. And so we will stop here. And when we come back next time, we'll pick up on what is called the war on terrorism. Students, I hope you remain safe.